Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of my series going over the movies and shows I watch in a given month. Today, I am here to talk about all of the movies and shows I watched in September. As always, all of the media I'll be talking about has been ranked from worst to best, and you can otherwise track everything I watch on my Letterboxd profile. A change I am making to not only ease the editing process for me, but also for not wasting your time, is to not talk about movies or shows I've already spoken about in other videos, or plan to talk about in the near future. Instead, you'll just get a lightning quick glimpse of things that will be talked about in the future. Are you ready? Bam! There you go. Otherwise, no sense wasting time getting to that sweet content. Let's start things off by talking about Venom! Let There Be Carnage. Good golly, please don't make me say that stupid subtitle again. Now, I enjoyed this movie more than the original, but the improvements here are marginal at most. If anything, the sequel to Venom has more room to breathe since it wasn't trying to be a corporatized mess of boring commercials for future movies. The good stuff of that original movie was severely shafted by what the producers tried to shove in there, apart from it being just super generic and stupid. With this, however, there was no need for a preamble. The film gets going immediately and rarely lets up its energy. The brisk runtime is beneficial towards the movie never having much of a significant lull, and there is more successful comedy from the truly goofy conflicts between Eddie and the symbiote, even though I myself didn't ever laugh. At least a lot more time is spent between these two, and for the sake of pure entertainment value, this movie surpasses the original to a degree. Otherwise though, this is largely a repeat of the themes and basic storylines of the original, and the characters have the same boring arcs as before, albeit Venom preaching a tongue-in-cheek but painfully on-the-nose message when he finds himself in a club. Some may find enough to enjoy out of this ridiculous story that could pretty much be classified as a romantic comedy, but in terms of building off the original movie, there's not much to say about how it advances the story or tries new things, making for what is ultimately a bad sequel. It also emanates much of the same tired tropes and cliches you've already seen in other superhero films, forgettable villains and ham-fisted dialogue alike. The only thing people are gonna remember this movie for is its tease for another movie, so there you go. I don't think anything speaks to this film's lasting value more than that. Next we've got Free Guy. Free Guy is a great big batch of hypocritical filmmaking. It's nowhere near the level of blatant conceptual incompetence present in something like The Lorax, yet I find it funny that for all that Free Guy tries to say about people who strive to make something unique and special, it got morphed into what is essentially the movie version of the exact type of Fortnite trend chaser game it paints in a negative light. The concept for the story is cool, it just happened to be fluffed up by a lot of contemporary stuff that really annoys me on a personal level. You could chalk that up to the cringe sides of gamer culture, lame jokes, and very mixed quality on the references. Look, I love seeing a lightsaber show up in a movie as much as the next guy, but I mean, really? And the appearance of Cap's shield too? I do appreciate that Free Guy did try something new, and despite flaws that pervade throughout the movie, I have seen worse. For the target demographic, I'm sure this is working wonders. As a more cynical gamer and movie fan, I just found a lot to be irked by. It relied on stupid conveniences and contrived conflicts, but it did what I think matters greatly in telling a story, which is making the stakes matter to the characters you're watching, and that goes for both the real-life characters as well as the NPCs. If this movie toned down the constant non-jokes and tried to infuse more heart into the story, it could have been something truly special. As it stands though, Wreck-It Ralph is still the best video game movie that wasn't adapted from a video game. Free Guy had the potential to supplant or at least be on par with it, but I think that was squandered by the studio understanding their audience a bit too well, leaning too heavily into satisfying their base expectations and not doing too much that was surprising. If you really want a great version of the story, just watch The Truman Show. After that, we've got Black Widow. There's not much I could really say here that I haven't already remarked about in the MCU video I put out in August. In terms of the movie's quality, my opinion did not change on a second viewing. I still find it to be one of the more listless Marvel movies out there. Watching this with my in-laws, though, reinforced my belief that this could have been better received if Marvel decided to produce it between Civil War and Infinity War. Present the same story, but place even more emphasis on how much the act of Natasha clearing her ledger is impacting her moving forward. Knowing that the movie released when it did though, made it seem like Marvel cared less about that as opposed to filling in gaps in the timeline, as well as setting up characters for future movies. Man, what a bunch of missed potential. Following that up, we have My Fellow Americans. I wasn't paying 100% attention to this when my in-laws put it on since I was playing Metroid Zero Mission at the time, but it has its moments. James Garner and Jack Lemmon being vicious political rivals made for some enjoyable caustic banter between the two. Otherwise, not much about the story or character moments really stand out from most other mediocre 90s comedies, especially since its story feels like every other road movie from the era. It also dabs a bit into casual racism and sexism, which is great? I don't know, it was fine enough for one watch I guess, but I'll never be compelled to watch it again of my own choice. Up next is Labyrinth. Man, I remembered liking this much more when first watching it several years ago. One cannot fault this movie for its creativity, for the practical effects, costumes, and most especially the puppets all look great. The wizards at the Jim Henson Company fired on all cylinders when creating the world of Jareth's kingdom, but I was disappointed to find that the story was much less compelling on this second watch. I think I would have been more interested if Jennifer Connelly's Sarah didn't have such stilted character development, along with her performance leaving a bit to be desired. I mean, I know this was one of her first roles, but her character's biggest change occurs literally 5 to 7 minutes into the movie as she regrets accidentally sending her baby stepbrother into Jareth's clutches, and then for the rest of the movie, she's mainly just moving on from one obstacle to the next without undergoing any significant improvement as a person. The plot itself also slowly moves along with what felt like filler padding out the runtime prior to Sarah and her companions reaching their ultimate goal. Not to mention that Jareth himself is a cool villain in appearance. I mean, you can't argue with David Bowie's wonderful head of hair and crotch, but in practice he's not much of an active threat. Labyrinth exists in this odd place where it can create nightmare fuel for children through its garish creature designs, but doesn't emphasize the threat of those creatures enough to legitimize what's at stake. I will ultimately keep this movie in my collection since my wife has a lot of nostalgia for it, and as a fan of Jim Henson, I admire the technical proficiency of what his team accomplished here, but I doubt it will be a personal favorite of mine. And then we watched season 6 of Nailed It. Is it just me or did a season of this show just come out? I mean, hey, I'm not complaining. It's an enjoyable, wholesome baking competition that my wife and I are always in the mood to watch when new episodes come out. For those unfamiliar with Nailed It, you basically get to watch 3 amateur, everyday bakers tackle desserts you would need years of culinary training to competently put together. The entertainment value of the show, then, is not only seeing these people fumble up these recipes, but also the dad jokes that get thrown around by the judges, comedian Nicole Byer in particular. I guess my big problem with the show, though, is that Netflix only produces a handful of episodes every so often, meaning that there's never enough to make the experience fulfilling. The episodes themselves are short as well, so whenever a season is put out, it's over too quickly, and the result is ironically too similar to how a Sugar Rush feels. There's an all too brief burst of energy, and then you're left wanting more once it's over. It doesn't help that this latest season leaned a bit too heavily into the random quick-cut humor you might expect to find in YouTube videos, and not a lot of it worked on yours truly. My wife and I will still watch new seasons when they come out, but I can only hope that they can feel longer lasting in the future. And then back to movies, we have The Karate Kid. It makes perfect sense that the director of Rocky was hired for this. While there are obvious differences in themes and characters, it's more or less the same story when broken down to its basic elements, albeit Rocky had greater strength in the main protagonist's struggle not just being his bout for greatness as a boxer, but also in overcoming his socio-economic status. Those elements are also here, but not quite as nuanced or developed. It's closer to a teenage boy's fantasy than a full-fledged underdog story in my opinion. I don't want to resort to simplified comparisons, but The Karate Kid just didn't quite hit the same, while the pervasive 80s cheese dates it to a degree. Still, it's got plenty of value in the moments where it really shines. Pretty much every scene shared between Ralph Macchio and Pat Morita is great. The payoff of Danny realizing the purpose behind Mr. Miyagi's training methods is a golden movie moment, to name an example. Their relationship is an excellent anchor to the whole movie. I just wish that the other relationships and plot lines were stronger, for then this whole film could have struck a deeper chord with me, both for its pacing and emotional impact. But it wasn't bad. I'd probably be up for rewatching it sometime. Sticking with the martial arts theme, I also watched Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Again, like with Black Widow, there's not much I could really say that most people have already said, other than that I was satisfied with what I saw. Apart from the third act devolving into a bunch of CGI mush and overblown action, the story and presentation actually had more passion put into it than most MCU properties of late. I use the term passion lightly, since individual creativity and expression doesn't seem to be the strong suit with most Marvel movies, considering that that the studio aims to please every single global market they possibly can. Notwithstanding, Shang-Chi had a stronger grasp not only on how to carve out its own cultural identity, but also try to have its own artistic voice. The action in particular implements a lot more wide shots, sweeping camera movements, and complex fight choreography. Many people have made direct comparisons to wuxia and martial arts films of East Asia, and that's certainly what the filmmakers were intending, ultimately to effective results. It helped me to be more legitimately invested in what was taking place in the story, and I'm excited to see more from Simu Liu's Shang-Chi in the future. Also, what a treat it is that Western audiences now have a greater exposure to a great actor like Tony Leung. He gave us one of the MCU's most layered and compelling villains for sure. Now, a film that might surprise you in being ranked higher than the others is Malignant. I'm totally okay with stupid, predictable schlock if it's made by an expert of their craft, the likes of which director James Wan very much is. It feels like this is the kooky culmination of everything he's learned from being the director of Saw, Insidious, The Conjuring, Furious 7, and most especially Aquaman. The combination of elements from these vastly different movies is not a seamless, perfect one, although there's a reason why so many people have left this movie surprised by what they were given. Some of the effects implemented for the environmental transitions and the villain's design were a little questionable, but this otherwise oozes so much color, image clarity, and creative framing that the visual stimulation outweighed the script's shortcomings for me. Others have talked about the Italian horror influences, but this is such a James Wan joint, replete with how did they do that cinematography and one of the best action scenes of the year. If you watch this and absolutely despise the experience, I would understand, but as someone who falls on the ultimately positive end of the spectrum, I'd also be happy to share my enthusiasm with you. Shove popcorn and soda into your face, for this dumb thrill ride is a lot of fun. Try to go into the movie knowing as little as possible, for you'll find this to be a more surprising and wild ride if you do. And now for something a little more lighthearted, my wife and I also watched Atlantis: The Lost Empire. Growing up as a child of the late 90s and early 2000s, watching movies in full screen with pan and scan in full force does things to you. The VHS tape my parents owned of this movie imprinted itself onto my brain with how certain shots looked and moved. Now watching it again as an adult, I was constantly looking at these images thinking, how many details did I miss out on as a kid? Additionally, I could even remember shots from the VHS version that were quick cuts between certain characters talking, only to realize that those actions were originally all taking place within the same frame. Oh, how home media from those days botched up movies. We're now living in a luxurious age where movies not only look better, but their original presentation formats are being preserved, which makes the colors of cinematic animated movies pop much more stronger because of the quality high-def transfer. But aside from that, Atlantis is a solid movie. Disney fans really like to prop this one up as a project that deserves the high-budget live-action remake treatment, and as much as I despise those types of movies, I'd tend to agree. I could see this being solid potential for a live-action remake if they devote more time in the script to fleshing out the Atlantean culture, as well as the relationship between Milo and Kida. Still, if such a remake never happens, at least I'm proud to say that I belong to the group of people that can appreciate what this movie accomplished. And sticking with animation, I also watched Ghost in the Shell. This was yet another movie I planned on watching on the big screen, but time wasn't on my side. In this case, I'm even more bummed because it was being presented on the biggest screen, the IMAX at Arizona Mills, which is the largest cinema in the state. Oh well, my TV at home sufficed. Ghost in the Shell will have to be further dissected on more rewatches because its very short runtime causes its intersection of genre thrills and sci-fi philosophy a la Philip K. Dick to be a little bit too much to take in at once. But for what it's worth, it's clear to see why it's influenced so many different subsequent stories, particularly in the realm of cyberpunk. So many specific images and themes have made their way into other works this film specifically influenced, like The Matrix. And much to the credit of Mamoru Oshii and his team, there's plenty to glean from concerning themes of reality, the meaning of being human, technology, and privacy, while it's also just a fun, action-packed story about cyborg cops if you choose to ignore the deeper subtext. Ghost in the Shell is a great example of adult-oriented animation. And then as far as comedies go, I watched Three Amigos. You know, there's some people who like to accuse me of not liking fun movies, and my answer to those people is that many of those movies just aren't that fun. But Three Amigos? That was what I call fun. The way to measure a comedy's effectiveness for me is whether I laugh out loud more than once, for it can be hard for me to truly laugh at something. However, when I watched Three Amigos at a Tuesday night screening near my house, I laughed out loud in a not very full auditorium multiple times. I felt absolutely no shame in letting loose and allowing the film's excellent sense of humor to take hold of me. The story of a group of people being hired to do something totally different and more dangerous than what they originally signed up for is not that compelling to me, since even the fact that Three Amigos is a parody of that exact type of story doesn't change how tired the serious story beats feel. Still, it's more often silly than serious, so I had a lot of fun. Simple as that, folks. Now, I mentioned a movie about cyborg cops earlier, and I also watched this one. Yeah, speaking of fun movies, here's another one that I had a blast with on a Tuesday night in the theater. Yet despite that, it's also quite sad as to how this movie's satire holds true today. Not that I'm one for a deeply political discussion, but themes omnipresent in this story could be dissected and appropriated to tons of different things happening in America today. Since its plot beats are tied closely to the idea of corporations controlling aspects of American life, one could take this story and ask the questions, who's really invested in protecting who? Who's on the side of self or the common good? Is technology gonna pave the way for the evolution or the downfall of man? I never expected a movie from the late 1980s called Robocop to provoke such thought, but hey, I love being surprised in that way. Smart storytelling doesn't have to be presented with a straight face and flat tone. You can be playful just like director Paul Verhoeven was with this material. And on that note, even if you ignore the scarily prescient social commentary, Robocop is about as entertaining and well-made as a movie about a bloodied corpse turned into a cybernetic police officer could be. Not all of the effects hold up tremendously, but for what these people could achieve at the time, the film was pulled off stunningly well, especially with the prosthetic work done to morph Peter Weller into a convincing cyborg. For all those filmmakers out there looking to make something self-referential, violent, yet completely confident in itself, look no further. But the best film I watched in September was Prisoners. In stark contrast to the movies I just talked about, Prisoners absolutely is not what one would call fun. This is the kind of movie that you don't want to start if you wish to maintain the mood while on a date. After all, it takes the quite basic concept of a child abduction thriller, and Denis Villeneuve captured it in a raw, matter-of-fact, and brutal way that echoes the grimy despair present in films like David Fincher's Seven. Because of the masterful execution behind and in front of the camera, though, it's a film I couldn't take my eyes off of. Even as it clocked in at about 2.5 hours, the film never felt as though it presented unnecessary information or wasted my time. Each nuance in the screenplay and performances built upon the cinematic power that this incredibly dark story possessed. It works because it's a project that the cast and crew clearly believed in, and treated it with the utmost seriousness and craftsmanship they needed to tell what is an uncompromising, yet wholly original take on a familiar type of story. And what's more is that the film knows how powerful it can be to choose to not show something violent. Prisoners could have easily been even more gross and disturbing than it already is, but the choices made to obscure certain images heighten the drama through sounds and provoking the viewer's imagination. Sorry that I can't be more specific as to how and when the movie does this, but I prefer to be vague here since it's really a film you should seek out for yourself. The experience is not an uplifting one, yet there's much to gain from its gripping and well-told story. And that's it as far as movies and shows go, although I do have one more thing to share, since I think it kinda counts. My wife and I went to the Immersive Van Gogh exhibit touring across the country. The one local to our area is housed at an art gallery in downtown Scottsdale. On one particular day that we both had off work, we decided to take advantage of our lucky amounts of free time and check it out, especially since my wife is a massive fan of Van Gogh's work. For those unfamiliar, the exhibit is a somewhat animated representation of his paintings set to various genres of music. You go into a large room and simply sit down as you let the mesmerizing images and sounds surround you on all sides. Surprisingly, it wasn't quite as long as we expected, for the whole presentation lasted about 30 minutes. Despite that, the experience was worth the hefty asking price. The super impressive melding of animation and music envelops the audience with the moods of Van Gogh's iconic oil paintings, and not one sequence of animation feels like a repeat of the previous. I suppose then that it's good that the experience is short, since it didn't overstay its welcome. If it proceeded for much longer, it could have been a pretentious or overwhelming exercise in modernizing classic works of art. But for what it was, the experience was both a unique work of art on its own and a beautiful tribute to a gifted artist the world lost too soon. In the end, what really mattered to me is that my wife enjoyed it. We'd both recommend it as a good entry point for familiarizing yourself with his art, or if you're not interested so much in the art itself, at least it'd make for a relaxing activity to do while on a date. Aside from that though, thanks for watching another episode of my What I've Been Watching Lately series. I'm working hard on other reviews and videos that are more unique, so please stay tuned for those. If you liked what you saw and would be interested in those projects when they're finished, please consider subscribing to the channel and joining the notification squadron so that you don't miss out on my future videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great one.